So at GloQur, the Global Qur'an, we are studying Quran translations, and we very often get the question, especially from Muslim audiences, whether this is actually possible, whether the Quran is translatable, whether we can talk about Quran translations, or whether we shouldn't prefer to talk about something like the translation of the interpretation of the meanings of the Quran, or whatever expression you prefer. And because we get this question so often, we decided to have a talk about it and share some of our thoughts with you.
Yeah, so the first question is translation of the Quran possible? And probably the easiest answer to that is to say, well, the Quran has been translated many, many times. Even just in English, there are dozens and dozens of translations. So obviously something here is possible because on a practical level, it is being achieved. The nature of translation, if you engage in the practice yourself, you would know that inherently it is subjective activity. There is always going to be some kind of quote unquote loss when you are translating a text. And the more complex and the higher literary value of that text is, the more, in a sense, you're going to have to accept to lose or to sacrifice in terms of meaning, in terms of structure, rhythm, beauty, poetic value, however you want to put it. So the fact that the Quran is seen by many as the highest literary artifact of the Arabic language, it is a theological text, it is scripture, it is revelation for Muslims, well then obviously there are going to be things that don't carry through in translation. But that doesn't affect the basic question of whether it's possible to translate the Quran. Just like any text, there's going to be something that goes when you translate, or something that, as we say, the big cliche, that's lost in translation.
But then, of course, I mean, Muslims often argue that the Quran is not any kind of text. I mean, from a translation studies perspective, you could make the point that translation becomes more difficult when the text is older, the languages are very different, there's a big cultural divide and so on. And all of this is certainly true for the Quran, but also for a lot of other texts. But then from a believer's perspective, many make the point that the Quran is a special text that is completely inimitable, and also says so about it itself. So the Quran itself says you can't imitate it, and that's an argument that we often hear for why translation actually is not possible.
Yeah, so translation would be like bringing its like, yeah.
And many scholars since early time had a kind of fear that, you know, the translation may somehow replace the original text. And at the same time, the idea of dawah somehow imposed many scholars to accept the idea of translation to a certain extent. Many of them, they would not be somehow very comfortable with the idea of literal translation. But then if you somehow use commentaries and interpolations, and you add some footnotes which clarify the meanings, that would be possible. And this kind of idea of comments which represent a specific reasoning of some particular human being which is fallible is very interesting from the scholarly perspective as a kind of spatial temporal feature of each particular translation that we can study and understand.
Yeah, so I think we're already touching on some of the Islamic theological and legal contexts in which this issue has been debated. Could you say anything more about that, Elvira?
Yeah, I mean, there were different ideas how to tackle this issue, and from the legal perspective, it would be also interesting to explore what is actually the religious text and what is the boundaries of this text, because if we speak about the original Quran in Arabic, it also has the idea of purity, that you cannot touch it without ablution, you have to have a special reverence to it. But what is the translation then? Does it have like kind of similar attitude for the people, or what is the limit of religious text? And then we have also debates. So for instance, in Hanafi tradition, there is one of the opinion which kind of important in the tradition, that you still have this kind of attitude towards the translation, and when you approach it, when you use it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the Hanafis are one of the legal schools in Islam. There are several. And I think the Hanafis are often brought up in this context because they are the only ones where we have the opinion that in certain cases, the translation of the Quran could actually be recited in prayer. So, I mean, one of the reasons why the Arabic Quran is so important and not just completely replaced by translations is because Muslims recite it in Arabic during prayer, and prayer is obligatory. So, and most schools of law believe that you can only recite the Arabic Quran in prayer. But there is a difference of opinion in the Hanafi school, in particular with regard to people who don't know enough Arabic yet to actually recite the Quran in Arabic.
And what's interesting about that is the reasoning that underpins it, because that view in the Hanafi school, which usually is understood to apply only to a situation of necessity, so a person hasn't yet learned how to recite the Arabic words of the prayer, so and of the Quran in particular, so they're allowed then to say the translation as a temporary solution. So most interpret it that way. But in any case, it just points to the fact that the translation of the Quran is given a certain amount of respect in the fact that it's carrying the meanings of the Quran, and therefore the words which are carrying those meanings are then given enough status to fulfill the prayer in that situation.
So historically, I mean, we're speaking about debates that emerged very early, like in the 8th, 9th century of the Common Era already, which is because Islam became a non-Arabic or not exclusively Arabic religion so fast. And we had a lot of Persian-speaking Muslims and Turkic languages speaking Muslims very soon who just wanted to know what the Quran is actually saying. So we also have evidence of translation activity very soon, although it's not very likely that people at the time conceived of translation in the way that we do today. So it was probably more like an explanation of the Arabic text, which was always there. So that it was not really a question like we had in Western European Christianity, for example, where the Latin Vulgate was the Bible in the Middle Ages. There was no question of actually having recourse to Hebrew or Greek texts. This never happened with regard to Muslims, definitely.
So could you tell us some more, Johanna, if you don't mind, about some of the modern contexts in which translation has picked up and some of the political contexts surrounding that?
Yeah, and I think this context is really important because a lot of the arguments that are being brought up until today against the translatability of the Quran, but also in favor of the importance of translations, really emerged in mostly the late 19th and early 20th century. And a lot of people are actually not aware of the politicized context in which this happened. So first of all, we had the collapsing Ottoman Empire in which nationalist ideas were taking root. And then when the Ottoman Empire kind of expired and the Turkish Republic started to emerge, there was actually this idea of replacing the Arabic Quran with the Turkish Quran. And then, of course, a lot of people were alarmed at this and didn't want this to happen and were vehemently opposed to it, like the Mufti of the last Mufti of the Ottoman Empire, for example, but also a lot of globally active Muslim activists. So this was one reason why there was a lot of polemic, because people had the actually not entirely unfounded fear that the emergence of translations might be used to actually replace the Arabic Quran and not just give people access to some of its meanings. Then there was also the emergence of missionary movements, and especially the Ahmadiyya movements, which came up in South Asia around the turn of the 20th century. And they were the first who heavily invested in Quran translations, including in European languages. And that was a novelty among Muslims at the time. It was really successful. We had a lot of converts in England, for example, due to the existence of English Quran translations. And this also forced other Muslims to kind of position themselves. And a lot of people then simply opposed this because they were opposed to the Ahmadiyya movement. They considered them heretical. And because so many of the Quran translations that emerged between the 1910s and the 1930s were Ahmadiyya translations, we then had this pushback against it. And the third aspect is the Christian influence, because if you look at these translations that emerged, Elvira mentioned footnotes, for example. And this is really something that comes from European printing culture. So we didn't have this in classical Muslim texts. And suddenly we have translations that are sometimes monolingual English or whatever language, which was a novelty. Sometimes they have footnotes, they have column style layout. So all kinds of innovations, including this kind of genre of translation where the translated text could really be read on its own without understanding a word of the Arabic original. And this is also something that caused a lot of opposition because people were afraid of just imitating Christianity and also imitating the status of the Bible in Christianity, which is different from the status of the Quran in Islam. For example, because nobody in Christianity is required to recite the Bible in its original language or anything of that kind.
I think it's also interesting, like in terms of the way how a Christians see the translation of Bible as a kind of more audience-oriented text, while a Muslim translator still like can be quite similar in the way of shaping their translation in similar form as a footnotes with this kind of genre. It's still kind of always more text-oriented rather than audience-oriented text. At least the way how it is presented, so they try to be more kind of faithful in terms of their translation.
Yeah, it's interesting how you noted how the ruling from the scholars, the fatwa that they're giving, is very sensitive to what's happening on the ground. So yes, sometimes things are shrouded in theoretical terms based on scriptural, textual proofs, but to a large extent, you know, the changing nature of realities affects the ruling that's given. So on the one hand, there are those who reacted to the trend of heterodox groups, as it were, who were promoting translation, therefore associated translation with those movements, as you pointed out. On the other hand, there was the case to be made that we, whatever that means, the orthodox mainstream Muslims, as they would see themselves and frame themselves, need to respond to that by putting the correct doctrines out there. And probably that argument has won out over the course of the 20th century into today, except there are still books which are published to this day which are against the whole notion of Quran translation. So there remains, you know, a minority of scholars who are still maintaining that translation is problematic.
Well, what we often see, I think, is that this problem is solved on the semantic level. So we have a lot of people who actually translate the Quran if we take the word translate to mean what Sohaib said in the beginning. I mean, to imply that this is not a perfect equivalent of the source text, but just the translator's best attempt with inevitable loss and also additions. But they call it, like, as I said in the beginning, translation of the interpretation of the meanings or something. And I mean, for all intents and purposes, it's still a translation, but they avoid the implications and the potential problems they see by choosing this designation. And this is also, I mean, if we look at the history of this in the course of the 20th century, we see how fast the attitudes changed, even with the same people. Like, for example, in Egypt, Rashid Rida, who was a very influential Muslim intellectual who published a global Islamic newspaper or magazine at the time. And he was totally against Quran translation. His opinion was very influential until the 1920s. And then in the 1930s, he suddenly says, okay, I've seen how useful it is for dawah. So maybe for like proselytizing, even in Europe, wow, even British people have embraced Islam because of Quran translations. So maybe we just shouldn't leave it to the Ahmadiyya. We should just do it ourselves. And a lot of other institutions and individuals change track a lot, very, very fast. And very often we just have like the only, you know, bastion of resistance that is remaining is this semantic strategy of not calling a translation.
That's very interesting, Johanna, because like we have this one fixed text and these fluid meanings which are around the text, which are in constant dialogue with each other. And especially like now, any new translation tries to, you know, somehow erase the previous mistakes which like mistakes in the previous translator and come closer to the original. So it's like a continuing discourse which tries to come closer to the original text, and there is no stop.
Yeah. I mean, that phrase is always quite funny, translation of the meanings, etc., because it implies that there's some other kind of translation that doesn't involve meanings. But I think that those who appreciate what translation is already understand it to be, as I said at the beginning, something which is mediated by meaning. It requires a certain amount of interpretation, which is open to different takes and different approaches. And anything that you end up writing as a translator is an attempt at translation. It can't ever be thought of as perfect.
Yeah, although I think this semantic solution also involves an attempt to emphasize the subjectivity of the translator. And I think this is understandable and legitimate from a certain perspective, because as a matter of fact, it's not always obvious to the people who actually use the translations to what extent they are dealing with the subjective opinion of a translator. So a lot of, I mean, especially in our culture and the way we use translations, a lot of people just use them without second thought as more or less a replacement of the original text. And I think the people who put so much emphasis on saying it's only a translation of my interpretation and so on, they just want to make this point very clear. And it's probably a matter of perspective whether you consider this necessary. It's just that to them, it seems extremely important to make that point clear to their audience.
Just the counterpoint to that is that I think that using that phrase, they have not made it clear, because they're still saying it's translation of the meanings of the Quran, rather than an attempt or translation of some meanings of the Quran, or translation of the meanings that I understood from the Quran. When they say translation of the meanings of the Quran, I think it's just as bold a statement as translation of the Quran.
Yeah, that's why I said translation of the interpretation of the meanings, but that's not actually what all of them do. Yeah.
How one can be sure that the meaning is actually correct? So, like, right. It's also kind of heavy statement if you say that.
I think that, so maybe they want to say something like attempt at translation of the Quran, something like this, you know.
Some of them say like translation of some of the meanings, or you know, something like that, in order just to make clear that it's not actually all the meanings. And I mean, this is actually a serious issue that we will explore further in a subsequent video. The question whether and how you can actually capture the whole range of meanings as they are, for example, explained in the tradition of Quranic interpretation, that is very multivocal and very rich. And this is definitely something that needs further discussion.